Welcome to the Cambridge Tech Podcast, talking all things technology from the heart of the UK's tech capital. Here are your hosts, Faye Holland and James Parton.
Hi, I'm Faye.
And I'm James.
So James, another week goes by. Just before we started this, you said you're going to throw some more randomness into this, which is just causing me deep anxiety. But tell me how your week's been first.
First of all, I don't want to give you anxiety because you'll report me to the podcast HR department, which I'm not sure we have that. But
I'll be it. Can I be it as well?
I'm not sure is that going to be a neutral kind of?
God, no.
But yeah, okay, so I'll start with the work stuff and then I'll throw you the random things. Yeah, another university-centric week for me. I attended the IE Expo at the lovely new Ray Dolby building on the West Campus. So that's the first time I've been there. Been watching that being built for the last couple of years. So it was nice to go in there for the first time.
And what's it like? I've not been in there either.
Yeah, very shiny. Yeah, lots, very modern, as you'd expect. You know, lots of glass, lots of kind of white walls. So hopefully they'll keep that spick and span. But yeah, nice event. You know, it was all about signposting the different entrepreneurship offers across the university to students and researchers. So I was there just talking about Trinity Bradfield Prize. And on that topic, we also hosted the last of our talks for this year's prize at Trinity College with IP21, which went really well. And just a quick reminder, deadlines for applications for this year's competition are the 30th of November at 11:59. At night.
Crikey, that's specific. Are you actually going to be up monitoring? And if anyone's at 11:59.20, they're out.
Well, yeah, I won't say on air that we'll let people submit late, but please do try and be on time.
Don't say that on air, whatever you do.
No, absolutely not. And continuing the kind of the travel theme, I also went over to our Chelmsford Centre to talk to our community members over there. And now the randomness. Are you ready?
Yeah, sure.
So what is the difference? I've never known the answer to this between peppermint and spearmint. And the reason I'm asking you this is I brought some polos yesterday and I realised I haven't ever brought any polos in my entire life. So I Googled them and they've been around since 1948. So they've obviously been successful, but I've contributed zero to their success until yesterday.
How could you get to your formidable age and not have had a polo or an ollop?
No,
you've never bought them. You're a freeloader. You're a polo freeloader.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yesterday was the first time I've actually paid for is it a roll of polos? I don't know. Yeah. So, but then I got a whole bunch of anxiety talking about anxiety. Like I was then given questions. Do you want polo or spearmint? Do you want spearmint or peppermint? And I don't know what the difference is, aren't they? I don't know. Do you know?
I don't actually. So
No.
would you, come on, get it out of your system. Enlighten me, please.
I don't know. I was asking.
You're joking?
Yeah, I didn't.
You can't do
No.
that. That's ridiculous.
No.
You can't ask a question and not know the answer.
No, I don't know. Maybe all of our listeners can write in and tell us the answer to that question. I'm not going to Google it because that would be cheating.
Well, I should have Googled that then and then I'd have maybe come over as smarter than just saying, no, I don't know. While we're talking about sweet things, I've driven my husband mad because one of my other business ventures is I feel there's a real shortage of licorice, right?
Oh,
No.
That's
So
it should be illegal.
I love licorice. And I'm like, I kind of suggested to him that I should have, like summer festivals, because I've got nothing else to do, right? Summer festivals, I want a licorice stall. And my dad would do it with me. And I think it's a cracking idea because I reckon there's loads of people like me that love licorice.
I feel like licorice was invented by people that hated their children. Why would you torture your children with licorice?
Oh my God, I'm going to get you licorice for Christmas. I'm going to reform.
No.
There are so many different types of licorice. Honestly.
Yeah, and all of it is wrong.
No. Okay, right. Well, we will agree to differ. But fans of the podcast, please tell me, are you a fan of licorice? Would you rather have a licorice or a polo? Should we should we do a poll and see if anyone follows on LinkedIn?
Maybe we'll be sponsored by who makes these things. Is it around?
Yeah, Bassett's is licorice. Or there are many other providers. So yeah, I get in the car and go to Amsterdam and go to a supplier over there. I'm that committed to it. But anyway, shall I?
So I'm learning so much by accident here. So you're like a licorice mule, are you? This is what you're bringing.
I think I could be. I mean, I have other ideas. I really am going to stop talking in a minute, but I have other ideas. Like, I think another thing at a festival is a roast potato van.
Oh, I could get on board with that.
And then we have all different types of gravy and things like that. So,
okay, this is good.
Okay, I've got you back on the right page then. Yeah. I'm sorry about that, everyone. I'm like, I've gone rogue, I think.
So how was your week then, apart from dreaming of licorice?
Again, I mean, I was going to say I've got 2 bonkers weeks, and maybe I'm losing my marbles a little bit in the midst of these 2 weeks. So my week last week, it was front-ended a lot with Chamber of Commerce activities. So I had one meeting last week with all the chairs across the UK chambers, organised by the BCC chair, Sarah Howard, which was really interesting. It's the first one I've done, actually, but it's really interesting to see the dynamics across the UK and what they're focusing on. And obviously there was quite a lot of talk about the expectations from the budget, which is tomorrow. So it was just really different, but you do get very focused on your own region and your own area. So it was quite enlightening to see all of that.
Were there themes, were there common themes or any particular standout challenges?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, everyone focuses on different things, as you would expect, because different regions have got different strengths. There was a lot on obviously supporting business, because that's what the chamber does. But really the lion's share was about the budget and how, trying to get solid decisions and then move out of the way and let businesses get on, I think was the overwhelming commentary from it. So yeah, I mean, it's just really great to be in that kind of circle of people and understanding influence. And it's good. We talk a lot about Manchester and the tech scene there, but Bristol's there. We're going up from a Cambridgeshire point of view, going up to Edinburgh. So actually, I think the Chamber's got a really big play in the whole of the tech ecosystem too. So that was the start of the week. And then on Wednesday last week, we had CAMS B2B, which is the flagship event from the Cambridgeshire Chamber of Commerce as well. It was really incredible. I mean, literally the whole day, we had board members walking around going, I've just had the most fantastic day. And they were part of it, but you were just bumping into loads of people. And we had people were speaking like Tim Minshall, Catherine Chapman, Jason Mashinchi. Obviously, we know all of those people. And then we had other organisations like British Sugar, Octopus Energy, Formula One. So it gave a lot to, different businesses and people, people that like us that go to loads and loads of events. Actually, it got you thinking a little bit differently. So that was good. And we also went live. We've been working on a massive evolution of the chamber with regards to their purpose and narrative. So many things have changed locally, and there was this whole brand release on the same day as the flagship event, because obviously we're not all crazy people. So that was really exciting and went down really well. So that was that took me to about Thursday, I think, and a lot of the week last week was also on prepping for the launch of the startup and scale up services from Cambridge MC, which we did over at the Bradfield Centre.
Yeah, how did that go? It was a packed room, I believe.
Yeah, it was really good. I mean, we had a few people not. I mean, weather always changes things, so we had a few people not there, but we had over 100 of this, and we had startup and scale up businesses. It was really funny because one of my clients sat there and said, it's not very normal that I would come out to a consultancy pitch event, but actually that was really, really insightful. So I think what we presented landed really well. We've got lots of follow up from it straight away. And I think part of it is because what I've done, what people within Cambridge MC have done, we've been there, we've lived it. We understand the challenges of starting up and scaling up, and we've just come up with a package that I think works really nicely. So yeah, we've got a lot of work to do now to follow up on that and get the message out. We launched it in Cambridge because that's logical, but it's global applicability, so now we've just got to get the message out a little bit further.
The thing I love about your events is how punchy they are. You don't drag it out for an entire day with like panel and presentation after another. So
yeah. Well, I stood up
that's-
at the front at the podium. People said to her, I'd written a post-it note. That was my script, and what I can't even remember what it was now. It was grow and evolve. They were my only 2 words that I had as my intro. And I stood at the podium completely ad-libbing and just went, unaccustomed as I am to speak at this podium. I was just like, where did that come from? What a lunatic. But it made people giggle, so that was good. Then one other thing which I do want to shout out was the relaunch of Anne Fisher's Women for Technology group, which is now, it's been relaunched in conjunction with St John's Innovation Centre. So I went to that straight after the Cambridge MC launch. Really interesting and quite a different crowd actually from the normal Women in Tech group that you would expect to see. But I spent most of my time, obviously I was saying hello to lots of people, but with Victoria Johnson of VetCT, and we had a really great chat about everything from leadership and culture to bootstrapping and selling business. So it was really, really nice to catch up with a fellow businesswoman and woman in tech. So that was great. And, let's see, and good luck to the initiative coming out again. And this week, the mayhem continues. I'm off to Norwich Research Park later on today to judge Innovation Hot House, which is their competition that 21 to Watch has supported from the outset. So yeah, the mayhem continues again this week, and let's think about other food things that we can talk about on next week's podcast too. Crikey. Anyway, should we do news? I think there's a couple of pieces, one each today.
Yeah, let's kick things off. So new research, we always like to share research when we see it. So some data around deep tech and life science startups that have spun out of European universities. They have a combined value of $398 billion, which and have also created over 160,000 jobs and from more than 7,500 startups. The European Spinout Report 2025 analyses European value creation and trends in spinouts, highlighting the region's leading academic institutions, the leading countries, sectors and founders. 4 universities led the way in terms of spinout value creation: Cambridge, Oxford, ETH in Zurich and EPFL in Lausanne. At the early stage, 86% of capital for these companies came from within Europe. But a trend that we've been talking a lot about lately is nearly 50% of late-stage funding for European deep tech and life sciences comes from outside Europe, mostly the US.
And it'll be interesting to keep tracking that, because I think that is going to change. All indications are saying that's changing massively. So. And then a piece of news from New Quantum. You will know them as a distributed quantum computing power player. They're headquartered here in Cambridge. They have announced 2 experts as part of their growing team. Richard Moulds, the architect behind Amazon's quantum computing service Amazon Bracket, will join the Strategic Advisory Board alongside Robert Souter, Roland Accra and Hermant Mardia. And Jonathan Cumming, a former investment banker turned global CFO with a track record of driving billion-dollar exits, has been appointed CFO and will lead New Quantum's financial strategy and long-term growth. So congratulations to both of them for joining a team that's definitely on a mission. So that's it. That there are 2 pieces of news. So James, would you like to introduce today's guest on the podcast? And you're going to love this one.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. So this week we're joined by Finn Stevenson, who is the CEO and founder of Flok.
So Finn, welcome. It's great to have you on the podcast with us today.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did this whole journey start?
So I originally studied medicine. I did musculoskeletal medicine postgrad, focused on spinal deformity. But I then went into initially a detour through professional sports. I was on the Olympic development program for rowing. Sadly didn't make it to the Olympics, but learned a lot from the experience. And then I've spent the last 8-9 years working in health tech and med tech. So I moved to Cambridge 2018 to work for a company called CMR Surgical. So surgical robotics company, which is where I met my now co-founder, Rick. We worked together there. And then I did the sort of UK go-to-market there. So set up the first NHS contracts for the Versius robot. And then I went and worked in Switzerland for a bit. And then Rick and I started Flok 3 years ago. essentially to try and address this huge fundamental challenge in healthcare around there being a supply-demand mismatch. So we actually know how to manage most of the conditions that people suffer with at population level. But the problem is, if we're fully dependent on putting people in a room or on a phone call with a clinician to deliver that care, it just doesn't scale to the level of demand. So we started with musculoskeletal physio and back pain specifically, and have built a new way of delivering that sort of care.
Let's dig into that, because that's a whole huge introduction. But I can't let you go without talking about CMR Surgical, because obviously this is one of the huge success stories within Cambridge. So when were you there in terms of their own scale-up journey? And then tell us a little bit about how you went about securing those kinds of contracts, because I'm sure when we talk about Flok, that's going to come up again. Yeah,
so CMR was a really formative experience for both Rick and I. He joined very early, sort of first 10 employees in the company, just after seed. I joined just after Series A, so we were still about a year before regulatory approval. So initially it was sort of more focused on market development and how we were going to get into the NHS and get those contracts set up. By the time I left, we were sort of 1,000 people and $3 billion valuation. So yeah, it was a real kind of learning journey from that perspective. Yeah, I guess in terms of experience getting into the NHS, we kind of set up those first contracts, which was great learning experience for me, and it was built on things I'd done previously around market access and sort of commercialization of health tech. So that was definitely valuable, and we've kind of carried with us now.
Let's jump back a little bit then. You flew through a whole bunch of really interesting stuff there. So when we were chatting, I think what's really interesting about the kind of genesis of Flok is all good startups seem to come from spotting a real need rather than just developing a technology and trying to sell the technology. So am I right in just recalling our chat where you were saying when you were a professional rower, you had immediate access to, high quality healthcare and physios and treatments, and you wanted to try and find a way to make that level of care more democratic and open to everyone?
Yeah, 100%. I think that, so, I mean, I'm like most rowers, I'm, 6'7" and don't have great posture, and, you'd be kind of training and would get musculoskeletal pain with your back or something else. But in that environment where you're not constrained from a resource perspective, you have some pain, you see the team physio who's there full time the same day, and a week later you're racing again. And for me, when I left that and, went and got a job, kind of normal existence, my back flared up again. And I found it surprisingly hard to get on top of. And I think for me, that was a real realization moment of, in theory, got a degree in medicine, had done my postgrad in spine conditions specifically, and had 3 years of exposure to full-time professional physiotherapy, and I was kind of finding it a struggle in terms of access to care. And I thought at that point there's likely to be a broader issue around how we're delivering these pathways at scale.
And again, some insights from your time with the Swiss robotics company, because you saying that only 1% of people ever have surgery?
Even lower than that. I mean, if you look at back pain specifically, so I was running the spine surgery business for this robotics company in Switzerland, and you'd start with this kind of huge market model of the people who have back pain every year. And then some tiny proportion of them, less than 1% will go on to have surgery. And of that proportion, some of them might have this slightly new procedure that you can make a new device for that makes it slightly better. And I think that I was very struck that in healthcare, a lot of the kind of focus and R&D and innovation is in that highest complexity level of the sort of care pyramid, where you're making new surgical devices or new drugs or new scans for quite a small proportion of patients. And actually, if we looked at specifically the back pain market, the vast majority, 99+% of people with back pain should never go anywhere near an operating theatre. Actually, what they need is early access to frequent, high-quality, multidisciplinary healthcare. And nothing had really changed for that population of patients, which is the vast majority of people. There wasn't really a kind of obvious innovation or care improvement. In fact, in many ways, it had probably got worse over the years, just as demand grew and cost constraints became ever more of a thing, particularly in the NHS. So yeah, I think we saw a huge opportunity to focus on the sort of neglected majority, which is most people at population level who experience these sorts of conditions and can't get the care they need.
What's clear is you've got a number of these really key insights. Another one that struck me when we were talking was your understanding about how the NHS operates, how it buys, how it kind of thinks. Could you kind of just walk us through that insight there? Because we obviously talk to a lot of startups that have an aspiration of selling into the NHS, but obviously the perception is it's just so challenging. Yep. You're almost better going internationally before you even try with the NHS. But you've taken the complete opposite approach.
We have, and I think you'll obviously hear lots of different opinions on this. I think what is definitely true is if you want the NHS to be your buyer, you can't approach them just like any other buyer, or sort of generic customer, because there are some very specific requirements and things you need to have thought about, long in advance of being able to actually efficiently commercialize in the NHS. We chose this route of initially commercializing. We basically sell our service to NHS trusts as a subcontractor, and then we treat their patients on their behalf. And that was a sort of very deliberate choice. It did mean that there were a set of things that we did early on to make sure we were setting ourselves up to be able to do that. But the benefit is actually the NHS in many ways a great customer, particularly if you're selling in at trust level. You've got literally hundreds of target customers who all share similar challenges, have similar processes, have almost identical funding models, and they're actually very good partners. They want to do this sort of innovation. They want to improve care. They want to improve efficiency, but you have to understand their constraints and the kind of system in which they operate if you want to be a part of that. And that's what we I think invested in early on, making sure that we approached that in a way that meant we could be adopted, we could be rolled out quite quickly, that we weren't getting late through a partnership discussion with the NHS and suddenly realizing we didn't meet some of their compliance requirements or that we didn't fit their funding model. That was kind of all baked in early on.
And so can you tell us any more detail on that? Was it, operationals, procurement? Was it those types of really functional things as opposed to the tech?
Yeah, it's both. It's both, I think. So there is, the actual approach of how do you partner with the NHS. I think, key learning for me over the years has been it's very, very difficult to change the way that money flows through the NHS. If you're dependent on that to commercialise, it's a tough path. If you want to really change either the sort of financial flow or very widespread behaviour in the NHS, that is difficult. And so you really need to fit within existing funding models. Whoever's paying your invoice fundamentally has to be the same department, the same money flow that is seeing the saving from whatever you're doing. It's very difficult to have that move around at kind of system level. There were also, I think one of the unusual things that we did that we feel strongly about is, I think the more typical route in health tech is you build a product and then you kind of sell or you license that product into providers like NHS Trust, and then they deploy it or apply it. And I think that has challenges as well, because they've got a million other things they're trying to do at once and a load of other tools, and it's very, very difficult for them to manage that just proliferation of technology as a quite a traditional provider in an enormous organization. What we've done instead, for various reasons, is we became a licensed healthcare provider. So we are a CQC approved healthcare provider in England, which means, rather than handing tech over to an NHS trust to care for their patients, we are directly caring for their patients for them using our technology and our clinicians. So we also staff these pathways with clinicians too. And that means that the whole sort of process, how that's funded, and even the procurement kind of frameworks that apply to selling into the NHS are, as a service, entirely different than if you're selling products. And I think the services route, it is much better set up for fast adoption.
You keep referring to the we, which is you and Rick, and obviously the extended team. So we had on one of the previous podcasts, Nish and Federica from Squish, and they were talking about how they built this whole relationship driving into work together, and the embryo of their idea and how they've now turned it into a business. So what happened with you and Rick? What was that motivation? How did those conversations start?
Yeah, so we obviously knew each other and had worked together before at CMR, which I think is actually, it's hugely helpful as co-founders. The kind of co-founder relationship is a very strong and intense one. You kind of spend more time together than you do with your spouse, and you need to share some pretty fundamental beliefs and kind of views of the world to make that work. So having worked together and also worked together in a very sort of technical setting was important and helpful. We had both become sort of independently interested in entrepreneurship while working at CMR. I think, being at a fast-growing startup, it seemed obviously interesting to try and understand how do you build a fast-growing company that is able to kind of scale and deliver large amount of impact across multiple countries. So we both become interested in that, and we're sort of exploring it in our own ways. So at the point that, I was in Switzerland thinking about, this sort of new delivery model for MSK, I knew that Rick was also sort of interested in starting a company and scaling a company. So we started kind of talking about what that would look like, and we started just with the problem. So, if you were going to design a new delivery model, what would you build? And how would you build it? And sort of did that and had those conversations pretty regularly over a 3-4 month period before deciding actually, yes, this is something that we both want to commit to, that we can see a sort of real vision for over a 10+ year period for what we could create. Now, of course, the we applies to the whole team who are kind of working every day to make this possible.
So just going back then to finish off the conversation about your insights around selling into the NHS. How did you find that initial pathway into the NHS to have those conversations, the kind of business development side of things? Was that from previous relationships in CMR and other places? And the second part of that question was, because you took that decision to become a service provider, was that baked into the kind of business plan that you would have a longer period of building the service, the company, getting the certification? How did that affect the kind of burn rate of the company, and how did that factor into the thinking?
On the service side, it didn't add time, because the kind of, I guess we are regulated both as a medical device, even though it's a sort of software-only product, it's regulated as a device and as a provider. The medical device regulatory timelines are probably longer than the provider timelines anyway. It's certainly added complexity in that we had to do both things in parallel, and essentially, both halves of the company are regulated by their own regulator with their own sets of rules and kind of different, often compliance requirements. So it definitely added complexity, but probably not time, in that we were able to do it in parallel and were kind of sufficiently well funded to do it in parallel rather than having to kind of do these things one at a time. On the route into the NHS, I think one of the things we did was make sure that our early evidence generation was in an NHS setting with representative patients. I think the NHS is risk averse, which everyone kind of always talks about, but is risk averse for good reason, in that they're responsible for all of our healthcare and kind of have to take that responsibility very seriously. I think by sort of understanding that and ensuring that we were building credibility with NHS partners early on, so that we made sure that the service we were developing was kind of what they needed, but also so that we were kind of building that trust and evidence base in a kind of real life setting to demonstrate the kind of safety and efficacy of this sort of system, so that we could then be adopted more broadly and now kind of commercially deployed across a number of NHS regions.
I think it's really refreshing as well to hear you talking, Finn, about working with the NHS. You've alluded to the fact that there's so many conversations. It's really hard work. It's really complicated. It's, you don't sell to the NHS as a whole entity. So I think it's really refreshing, and people will definitely find that interesting. Let's move on and talk about Flok now, and exactly what it is that you're doing and delivering.
We have built the world's first AI physiotherapist. So what this looks like for a patient is you will have been, referred maybe by your GP, or you'll have self-referred for physiotherapy to your local NHS trust. And, where we are contracted, you will be offered Flok as an alternative to traditional care. And so you can either, as you normally would, go on the waiting list and then see a human physiotherapist in person once, maybe twice. But a lot of people, that pathway is not particularly effective for. Our system allows you to basically have what appears like a structured video call with a physiotherapist, but there's no person on the other end of the call. So we are assembling, delivering and manipulating video in real time to respond to everything that the patient is doing. from the initial assessment and diagnostic triage of that patient through to weekly treatment appointments and ultimately discharge back to the community can all be done through our autonomous physio.
How have you built all of that intelligence to be able to deliver that?
There's two halves to the system, is the way I think about it. So fundamentally, if you're going to automate healthcare delivery, that you need to do two different capabilities. One is how do you actually automate the decisions? So how do you decide what needs to happen next? And then the other side is how do you actually interact with the patient? Because even if you're making good decisions, if you can't take a patient on that journey and build enough of a feeling of rapport and trust and credibility, then it's not going to work, even if the decision is good. So we have two separate pieces of tech that we developed for each half of the problem. On the decision automation side, this is, crucially not just trying to plug something into a generic, large language model off the shelf. I think the problem with that approach is these are inherently unpredictable systems, and there are real safety concerns around the ability to guardrail them consistently and have safe, predictable healthcare advice. It's obviously most particularly important in a healthcare setting where you're delivering this direct to patients, and they're going to take this at face value and kind of follow the advice you give them. So our AI system is an entirely different kind of architecture of system there. What we did was, our view is that the best way of controlling the behavior of a software system is to control the language it's written in, because then you're kind of mathematically determining what it can and can't do. So what we did is develop a new form of domain-specific programming language, specifically to encode clinical reasoning. So sort of broke down clinical thinking into the most fundamental constituent parts and built language primitives around them. And then that language is what our system is written in. So, we don't need to kind of, we can mathematically show that it's not capable of doing X if you don't want X to be possible in a healthcare setting, because it's actually controlled at language level and is deliberately incomplete. So that is the sort of decision automation, basically allows you to sort of execute the decisions that an expert would in that scenario repeatably, predictably, and transparently. So it's able to record its rationale in an electronic health record as it goes. And so you have sort of full observability of that behavior. On the patient interaction side, we do what's basically real-time video assembly and delivery. You'll never, with a sort of chatbot type interface, develop the kind of richness of interaction you need to actually treat someone, but also that interaction model is just not engaging or credible enough to build sort of trust and real buy-in from a patient over what can be a multi-month care pathway. And so what we do there is we use real video footage of a real human physio called Kirsty, who's in our team. What we've done is over time build up a database of lots of short strategic sequences of frames of Kirsty moving or saying particular things. And then as the video call with the patient is unfolding, what our streamer system does is essentially reassemble, remix and manipulate those sequences so that Kirsty can respond in real time and do essentially what the decision engine is instructing her to respond. Sort of feels like you're having a conversation with her, and she's just not on the other end of it at the time.
Really fascinating. So I'm kind of thinking this may be a very random or daft question, but who knows? When you were doing all of that and putting all of the instructions together, did you also have to think humans we do make mistakes? Do you also have to factor in all the risks of people doing it wrong and to be able to pick those things up too?
Yeah, not just the risks of people doing it wrong, but there are also real clinical risk in these pathways. Most people with back pain have back pain, but a small percentage of the patients we see coming in actually have serious pathology. So it might be spinal cord compression, a fracture of one of the bones in their spine, infection in one of the bones. These are very serious conditions that are, sometimes medical emergencies. And so we also have to ensure that the system is equipped to basically recognize those patterns and escalate those patients into urgent care immediately. So this is all part of the sort of regulatory pathway for demonstrating, is this going to be safe and effective at scale? So we obviously worked closely with the regulatory frameworks to do that.
For clarity's sake, could you just walk us through the user experience, like the patient? So they're obviously interacting with this AI agent, for want of a better word. there's obviously an interaction there, and as you say, it's real-time reaction to whatever the patient's saying. Are you delivering then through a program of exercise and treatment? How do you kind of measure compliance and all of those kinds of things? Yeah. How does that work?
It works pretty much like it would if you were just in a video call with a clinician. So, once you've been assessed, we've confirmed that there aren't any worrying patterns that mean you need to be escalated elsewhere, and you're gonna be treated by us. You're then going to have a weekly appointment with that AI physio that will take about half an hour, and they're going to talk about, how have you found it this week? How have you been getting on with these interventions? Have your symptoms changed? And they're going to give you an updated set of interventions to work on. And then there's support in our app to basically practice and work on those interventions and progress them in between appointments. So it's broadly like you would have if with a sort of telehealth pathway, just removing the dependency on basically staffing the other end of it, which is kind of the big cost and scale challenge for these sorts of care models.
So it's interesting that it's replicating the traditional model of weekly appointments. Is that because the NHS wanted it to be like that rather than like an on-demand model?
Actually, was something that we learned very early. It was a very interesting lesson. The very earliest concept of this from a product perspective was this, in theory, this can be fully on demand, right? So we had a kind of, you've got a physio in your pocket, you take it out, you push a button and it will account for everything you've done. If you did it an hour ago or a day ago, it will account for that and kind of adapt in real time. And what we found is that patients found this quite difficult to understand. That actually they were very willing and quite keen on this idea of, okay, what was physical is now going to be digital, but this reframing of you're not going to have appointments at a regular interval, you're not going to have kind of separate between practice and appointment itself, actually was quite a sort of behavioral barrier. And we had people requesting, well, can I book appointments? That's actually still a feature in our platform today, as patients book their appointments, although there's sort of technically no reason that we need that.
I want to book an appointment.
But it was one of the most common, people know if they book it, they're going to be more likely to do it. It's going to help provide structure. And I think it boils down to, this is, I guess, a pretty common principle in interface design, is this idea of skeuomorphic design. So I always like the example of the Notes app on your iPhone. When that first launched, it was designed to look like a legal pad. It was a lined paper pad of yellow paper that you would write notes in. Of course, the lines were entirely unnecessary, but we tend to, as humans, like the familiarity in a new concept when the modern or the tech version of the thing starts off looking as close to what the sort of physical world version of that product or service did. And so this kind of idea of skeuomorphic design in interface, I think, also applies to services. And what we found was it was probably too big a leap straight off the bat to say, well, actually, you don't need to only have a weekly appointment. You can kind of do it whenever you want, and it can adapt. Providing that structure and kind of a service design that looked more like the real world was a much more helpful framework for people. So we shifted to that.
In the same way that choosing the certification path with the NHS, you weren't shirking the big hairy problems. You talked about creating your own programming language, which is another massive kind of decision, I guess. But it's also interesting, you were explaining how you trained your LLM and you're actually using training techniques more from the 70s and 80s in terms of how humans learn rather than machines learn. So can you take us through that kind of the logic behind that process as well?
Yeah, it's not an LLM. So the work in the 70s and 80s was in a field called expert systems. So it's a sort of field of expert knowledge and coding and then execution that kind of hit a bit of a ceiling in the 80s. And then the kind of advance of newer techniques now means that ceiling isn't really true anymore, and you can kind of expand those systems. But I think the way I imagine it is, if you think of decision automation just more broadly, you've got a spectrum of, the simplest possible form of decision automation you can imagine is you just draw out a simple tree, if X, then Y. Very predictable, very safe. The problem is it can't cope with nuance. It can't deal with a large number of variables because the tree ends up with, a billion branches and it's impossible to draw, let alone kind of evaluate. The other end of the spectrum is your sort of ChatGPT type LLM, extremely flexible, doesn't need to know anything about the scenario you're giving it to kind of give you a response that seems very credible, but is, not is unpredictable, and in healthcare is not possible to deliver safely, but also is not possible to kind of get regulatory approval yet for that sort of frontline delivery. So the approach we're taking ends up being kind of somewhere in the middle there, which again, I think is more like how you teach a person. If you think of that decision tree versus LLM, you'd never try and teach a person to do something by following either of those approaches. The decision tree would be like, well, try and describe every scenario in detail that this person's ever going to find themselves in and what to do next, kind of implausible. You also wouldn't just throw a vast quantity of unstructured data at a human and be like, well, you figure it out. Here's a new scenario. Do the right thing. Of course, neither of those things would work. How we train people, how we train clinicians is to give them rules and teach them how those rules interact. And this is kind of the basis for clinical teaching is, well, this symptom matters. It matters more if you see it in combination with this. You can be less concerned if you see it, associated with this other pattern. Its progression is important. These rules and the relationships between them are how we actually learn kind of clinical reasoning as people. So our system is basically a way of encoding and testing those rules, and then a system that can and must follow those rules to kind of enact the decisions that you've given it.
I mean, not to suggest that you've only just scratched the surface with the potential of Flok, but could this be then, now you built this core technology, could this be moved into other fields?
Yeah, I mean, healthcare's keeping us busy, I would say. So we've got a lot to do in healthcare. The core tech is general purpose kind of clinical reasoning. And so we're currently training it in other conditions, so hip and knee conditions within MSK, but also women's pelvic health conditions, another kind of huge area of supply-demand mismatch. So we'll kind of expand clinically over the next year and continuously after that. Ultimately beyond physiotherapy as well, other areas of healthcare where fundamentally great care requires early, frequent access to a multidisciplinary pathway, and where that's very hard to deliver because these conditions are just so common. There's a huge amount of potential for kind of the scale of or the kind of proportion of what happens in healthcare today that you could see being delivered through this sort of model.
Huge potential and desperately needed. Isn't it? We've got to, for people's healthcare longevity, we've got to think of different ways of doing things. And this just seems very logical, and that would be relatively easy for the user to adopt. Because I think that's the other thing, that there's always if you're going direct to the patient, are they going to do it? So it just seems very, very much like it would fit and it would be easy to adopt.
Yeah, I think, and that's what we have seen. So I mean, one of our largest services is actually the MSK service across Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. We've seen there 68+% of people will choose this over traditional care. So and that's patients aged 18 to 75. It's a very broad range of people. But if you offer people same day access to care, no waiting list, 24/7 appointments, no travel, no time out of work, more frequent follow up, more personalization, a very, very large number of people think that is very compelling, and that's only going to increase as well. And I think the general level of comfort with technology and interacting with digital services is also just going to continue to go up. So yeah, absolutely.
You're obviously talking to the patients as well. They're satisfied. Are you getting that? Are you getting some good feedback from them? Yeah,
100%. I mean, that's the core of what we do. I think ultimately, if patients don't see this as at least as good, if not better, as traditional care, then we don't have a business. I think the value we deliver to ultimately the payer, which is the NHS or other large healthcare systems, is that patients A, choose this, and then B, are so happy with the care they get that they don't require any other care. So our escalation route of patients who are being managed by us and then either request or need to be referred into the trust for traditional care is very low. It's less than 2% of the volume we see. And so that kind of, you can only get that sort of metric by ensuring that patients are extremely happy and satisfied with the care they're getting in the pathway.
What kind of reaction have you had from the physiotherapy profession then? Are they supportive because it means they can focus on the patients that really need interaction with an actual professional, or do they see this as a threat? What's their kind of position on this?
I think very early on, there was a real mix. I think there was that, some people, lots of clinicians thought it was hugely exciting and, real problem that needed a solution. There was certainly early on some kind of concern or seeing as a bit of a threat. I think that mostly came from a misunderstanding of what it actually looked like. I think when you say AI physio, a lot of people imagine a chatbot with a slightly different front end, and without all the sort of safety and governance and assurance in place to deliver a clinically responsible service. I think we found that as we've been able to kind of have those conversations, engage with organizations like the CSP, which is the sort of professional standards and union for physiotherapists, like make sure that information is out there, people understand that this is about being able to offer patients a choice of care, an alternative that is very scalable, very cost effective. It's always going to run alongside traditional care. It's never going to be one or the other for all patients. I think there will always be some conditions, some patients who prefer or want or need in-person care. What we're doing is making sure that when, for the patients who it is suitable for and do want it, they can have that faster, frequent, more convenient care, and that also frees up capacity in the existing service to make sure that the people who need to be seen in person can be quicker. Ultimately, it's not in anyone's interest to be saying that anyone who needs physio goes onto the same 18-week wait list. That's not good for any of the patients on that list. It's also actually not a satisfying work environment for the clinicians in that service. If you're only able to see someone months after they needed help, and you've got a limited amount of time with them and you probably can't see them again, most clinicians didn't go into healthcare to deliver that sort of model. And so I think as we've been able to work with clinicians, with services, kind of show them what this means in practice, work alongside them and be good partners, they've been able to see that. And I think now, we see a huge amount of support and excitement from the clinicians in the services that we work with.
You're 3 and a bit years old now as a business, obviously going very well for you. What have been some of the highs and lows of being a founder and growing this business?
Yeah, I mean, being a founder is of course a roller coaster. I think one of the best pieces of advice I've been given is that nothing is ever as bad or as good as it seems. I think that's a sort of fairly helpful thing to hold in your mind as a founder, as you kind of ride what is often a decade roller coaster. Certainly on the highs front, I think it was of course hugely satisfying and motivating to start seeing this now rolled out at some scale in the NHS and patients coming through the service every day and giving us amazing feedback. And when you see patient stories about how we had a patient in the news this week who'd been in pain for 25 years and hadn't been able to get the care they needed and now has report zero pain as a result of care with us. That being able to have that kind of impact on people has been will always be our kind of big driver. Lows, luckily, have been more few and far between, but I think there are always downs. There are projects we've worked on that haven't come to fruition. There are things that we thought we'd be able to do faster that have taken more time or more cost. But I think ultimately, and I guess probably sometimes, I think the frustrating thing can be you've got to focus, which is important, but also means you don't do a load of things that would be great, would be super valuable. So I think that's probably part of the challenge of the kind of founder journey.
And in terms of the 3 years, you touched briefly on the kind of funding the company's raised. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about that. What's the kind of fundraising process been like? Reaction from the investor community?
So, I mean, we raised money very, very early on. To date, we raised 3.2 million in seed, or kind of pre-seed really, in that when we did the rounds, it was just after we'd registered the company, kind of pre-product, pre-team, just based on the sort of core technology concept and the scale of the problem and kind of this set of insights into how we were going to go about solving it. We've also benefited from grant funding from organisations like Innovate UK that have allowed us to sort of pursue some of these like more challenging pathways around regulation and evidence generation. But I mean, sort of appetite from investors has been, always really strong. I think healthcare is one of the largest markets in the world, and one of the challenges with healthcare investing historically has been that the sort of tools or products sub part of healthcare is the smaller part. Actually, there aren't a lot of examples of kind of hyper-scaled tool companies in healthcare, whereas about 80% of the spend in healthcare is on the services themselves, so the actual care delivery. And I think because we're building in that space, and have actually figured out how you kind of do this fully autonomous, full stack healthcare delivery, that's always been kind of very, very exciting from an investor perspective, because your addressable market is, that vast chunk of healthcare services spend that happens every year.
You've chosen to stay in Cambridge to scale the company. So I guess a couple of questions, why? And, what's your experience been of the Cambridge ecosystem around technology and startups?
I think Cambridge is a great place to build this kind of company. We have a lot of, I guess the things that we need as a company. It's pretty hard technology. So you need kind of deeply technical engineers, which Cambridge has a high density of. You also need teams who are used to working in a regulated environment, so the kind of medical device regulation, which again Cambridge is a real centre for. And then kind of life science and healthcare in general. Obviously, there's high talent density in Cambridge from a large number of life science companies. We've got the largest biocampus in Europe now on the sort of Addenbrooke's and Papworth site. So from a sort of intersection of hard technology, regulation and healthcare, I think Cambridge is sort of really sits at the centre of that Venn diagram. And on the kind of ecosystem side, I think as a result, there are lots of people in the kind of Cambridge ecosystem that are very interested or sort of where this is the sort of company they want to work for, or the sort of company they want to work with, which is obviously hugely helpful as you're kind of scaling a team.
It's been absolutely brilliant talking with you today, Finn. So I guess my final question is, we have a load of listeners. What's next? Is there anything that you need some help with, or you'd like to shout out for assistance with?
Yeah, great. I mean, we are scaling rapidly as we grow across the NHS, and we're growing into new conditions. So I think if you've been listening to this and thinking this is the sort of work you want to do, whether that's from a clinical perspective, whether it's engineering, operations, commercial, we're hiring across the board and growing really fast. So I think if it sounds like the sort of mission you want to be part of, you can check out our careers page. Our website is flok.health, and see if there's a role that looks like a perfect fit for you.
Brilliant. It's been great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Today's show was produced by Joe Donaghy of Cambridge TV and supported by our media partner Business Weekly. The Cambridge Tech Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms and on cambridgetechpodcast.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review. It'll really help others discover the show.